Does anyone know a good joke about communists? Because that is how I'd like to start one. The occasion is about how certain people like communism, but have never actually experienced it. Not only that, they make a push for implementing that government into Western society with some of the worst arguments.
Here, and I want to make a video about why, to this day, after the time in history when it was founded, we still need communism.
Okay, this is an 8-year-old kid. He probably doesn't even know how to build a Lego castle, so I'm just gonna let it slide. But when a grown adult makes a YouTube channel whose sole purpose is to promote communism, then it shows how some people need an education. But I have to say, of all his videos, this one grabs my attention the most. He tries to explain why East Germany and the rest of the Warsaw Pact was poor. And I have to say that it is a really sad attempt at doing so. It's so bad that I've actually compared it to Leafy's video, The Saddest Man on Earth. From that I can say that this is the saddest communist on Earth. For one, I'm actually feeling sad to have to debunk this video because this is so obvious to say. Now, the video is too long for a point-by-point response, but fortunately he makes only one point in the video, and the rest of it is about how the Western capitalist pigs are evil. But without further ado, let's first tackle his main argument.
If I were to give you $1 and I gave another person 10, chances are the guy with $10 is going to be able to do a lot more with what they've got than you can. The East-West German split has been for the most part the calling card of gotcha moments from people who are critical of socialism all the time. One needs not go into any more detail, it's basically taken as a given, well, obviously you'd live in the West. I'm here today to tell you that that sentiment is bullshit, to say the least. Why was East Germany, and for that matter, many other socialist countries, so poor by comparison to the West? If you intend clicking off in a few, I'd just like you to go away with this. The whole way that this debate is framed is very, very misleading, because it implies that there was a simple 50-50 fair game split between the two sides. In reality, the situation was far more murkier. If we were to split England, for example, into two, based on historical groundings of North and South, then they would be competing on very different playing fields from the outset. Why? Because the south of Britain has far more wealth, more technology, and everybody would want to flock down into the south simply because of one thing: London, a world city. Even if we split by population, again, the south remains a whole lot richer. Countries design themselves around very specific geographical locations for this reason. In my home county of Devon, the area is quite rural. We only have 2 relatively small cities, and about a quarter of the country is moorland. If Devon were to become autonomous, we would suffer without any outside assistance. For that matter, if you were to split the moorland areas off from the rest of Devon, the moor regions would suffer ever more so. This works in just about every single nation you look at. Some parts are richer than others. That's the reason why nations spend decades building up specialities based on that geography. Now we have to recognize this when we look at Germany. The split was not in half. Like physically, it was not in half. It was more so into thirds, with the West Division keeping the bulk share of the entire country. And what were the conditions in East Germany at that time? Well, as it would so happen, the eastern sections of Germany suffered the most devastation. Dresden, Leipzig, Dachau, Magdeburg, Chemnitz, Halle, and of course, Berlin, were all destroyed after World War II with their urban centres in tatters. And the areas around also lost a lot more due to the Russian invasion afterwards. In addition to this, East Germany has always been historically poorer and less industrialised than the West. If you look at the German population density in 1900 and I overlay it onto the East here, it never had the same degree of hustle and bustle as the West. Despite making up a third of the space of modern Germany, it had 17 million people on a 40-year average. Whereas the FRG averaged 58 million people with just twice the space. Unlike Britain, whose population normally centres around London and then spreads out, Germany's cityscape is more sparse due to historic reasons. The bulk of which, as you can see from this map, centers around the western pocket of Dusseldorf, Cologne, Dortmund, and Essen in what we might call the Westfalen complex of sorts, or maybe to use a less pretentious name, the Nordrhein-Westfalen. I try. And from there, it spreads downwards. Berlin, by comparison, appears to be more like an outpost. Now, this complex I mentioned, in fairness, it was heavily bombed during the war. However, along with Bremen and Hamburg, these were where the bulk of the German industry had been centered around for decades. It's easy to see why, and that's because of this, the Rhine River. An incredibly wide and long-stretching river that goes throughout West Germany. It's no coincidence that the Westfalen complex is situated right next to it. The East has historically been the breadbasket area of Deutschland, not the manufacturing hub. And there's actually a lot more to this than simply the agricultural aspect. Like I said, not all economic areas are created equal. And during the 21 years, the eastern half of Germany was mainly based around an export economy. And so for this reason, it was reliant upon outside and internal German support in order to strengthen its standard of living. Whilst the western parts were focused on heavy industry, the east was focused on agriculture, textiles, light industry, and Zeiss lenses. So throughout this time, there was a system of trades and traditions set up that indentured what the country was dependent upon.
I apologize for making these clips so long, but that is most of his argument. Basically, only a quarter of a video states the argument. According to him, the Eastern Bloc nations were poor because they had much less access to natural resources and sources of wealth. Let's explore why that argument is, in his words, bullshit. To use his own example against him, if person A had €1 and person B had €10, then yes, there would be a big gap between the two. But it's what they do with that money is what counts. If person A invested that €1 in a bank and gained interest or used that $1 to open a business which was cheap but effective, then person A would increase his wealth by a lot more. Meanwhile, if person B only spent all those $10 with no chance of any income or gave 9 of those €dollars to 9 of his buddies, then in the near future, person A would have a lot more money despite the fact that he only started with €1. And that is the difference between the Western capitalist system and Soviet socialism. They've spent more on just distributing that money rather than investing it. Geography and access to natural resources do help a lot, but it's no guarantee that your people will live middle class or wealthy lives. Do you need an example? Take a look at Japan. The country has virtually no natural resources because most of their country is just mountainous terrain, but they capitalize on very good ideas that made them more competitive in their fields to the point where they are one of the most developed nations in the world. Switzerland is another country that has very little natural resources but follows the same method. So are Belgium and Taiwan. Having a lot of resources doesn't mean anything when you don't know what to do with them. Ideas are what drives businesses and societies. Do you need examples on the opposite end? Look at Saudi Arabia, a country that has an abundance of important resources, mostly oil, but it packs all the money earned into its fantastically wealthy royal family, while the average GDP per capita of the country is only $500. Russia also follows the same example with its oil and gas resources, and Venezuela is another really good example. This is called the paradox of plenty, and I've mentioned this on my channel before. It talks about how resource-wealthy nations can have impoverished peoples. Now, the last part is the bulk of his argument, and it talks about how Eastern Bloc nations were obliterated in World War II, and it also made them poor during the Cold War.
America had this power, and it had far more wealth to give. During the war, its economy was the only nation that fought in it that went up as a result. And so during this time of rubble in Europe, it granted free range of opportunities for the United States to use and take advantage of. The USSR, the other superpower, had lost 1/6 of its population. Entire villages and towns across the country had been destroyed. In Belarus alone, if you've seen Come and See, you know that 600 villages were burned with their inhabitants along with them. And this was not even the beginning of its history. For the past 30 years, the Soviets had endured economic sabotage, sabotage by landlords, famines, a civil war, orphan crises. Upwards of 7 million kids lost their folks during the Civil War. This might also explain why Russian cartoons tend to have themes of orphandom. Entire railways, 85%, if my statistics are correct, were lost. Factories, mines, and all manner of infrastructure reduced to fractions of what they once were. So that was the background. America, by comparison, had achieved its industrialization by the 1860s. Russia only managed to get there by the time of the Second World War, and only just. So it was not in the nature of loaning out any funds so readily. If anything, it needed them itself. So all of these factors were instrumental in East Germany being on the worser playing field than the West. It had a poor industry to begin with, there was a grander devastation, a lack of markets, and it had to pay reparation. Now that all contributes, whether you like it or not, to a much poorer society.
This is where he is incorrect. First of all, Russia didn't start industrialization till in the 1930s. It started industrialization in the late 19th century under the reforms of Tsar Alexander II. Second of all, very similar to my previous point, having an economy in tatters doesn't have to slow you down. The pace of your recovery depends on how well you form your businesses, and that is all dependent on ideas. Very similar to that post, let's look at Japan, for example. The country was obliterated during World War II. Even if the Allies hadn't dropped the atomic bombs, the war would have ended quickly as Japan's military was very weak at that time and was being beaten into submission by bombing runs alone. And look at the country today. It sped up the recovery fast and is now one of the most developed nations in the world. Do you need another example? Look at South Korea. It was also in ruins because of the Korean War, and it endured coups and political instability during the 50s and 60s, and it is now a highly developed nation that is rivaling even Japan. Let's also remember that Eastern European nations turned into a ruined cavern in communist times, and then some former Warsaw Pact nations have risen to become prosperous. Poland, the Baltic states, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, all are nations that were impoverished but then skyrocketed right up after the fall of communism in Europe. Now, I could end the video here as I have basically destroyed his arguments, but as said previously, that takes up only a quarter of his video. In the rest of his video, he goes on a West bad, East good stance, the Western capitalist pigs, blah blah blah. Just to point out, it's all wrong, and I simply have to respond to it. For the first part, he says this.
As I'm sure you're all aware, the effects of the economic model that the DDR utilized was an attractor for mostly quote-unquote low-skilled jobs, but not so much for higher professions. Now, why is this? Well, it's simple. If you have higher skills, it's far more tempting to leave and accept the money that's being offered in the glorious, luxurious West. And yes, it is important to note that they didn't just flee. Many folks were actually bought by the wealthier side. Prior to 1961, loans of upwards of $100,000 were issued to any East German who defected, and sometimes even reimbursement for the property that was left behind, and a free apartment when they arrived.
Wow, now that is a very sad explanation. People moving to a place where they're paid more is basically mercenary work. Here's the thing, Commie. Most people aren't willing to move to another country simply because they will get a better salary. They left because of horrible living conditions in the East. It's not just the jobs they had, but also bad services, horrid living conditions, secret police, suppression of culture and religion, made life really bad in East Germany. And guess where it got it from? The Soviet Union. And of course, they would be reimbursed for their losses. This is something called the UNHCR, It is especially applies to people of the same ethnic groups. South Korea does the same to defectors from the North. And let's not forget how the North reacts to people trying to defect. East Germany followed the very same example. He actually touches on this subject later on in the video, but we'll get to that. For now, let's get to his next point.
With the Cold War brewing, America wanted Germany to be a heavily militarized area to pose a threat and a difficulty to the Soviet Union, something the Chicago boys would later call enlightened self-interest. The USSR wanted Germany to remain demilitarized to prevent reprisals.
America, fuck yeah, coming again to save the motherfucking day, yeah, America, fuck yeah, freedom is the only way.
Okay, I'm sorry, I just couldn't help it, but I can't help but laugh at how wrong he is. Germany was also demilitarized after World War II. It didn't even get its own military until 1955, and that was in order to add more muscle in the light of the newly formed Warsaw Pact that arose right next door. And it's worth noting that the Bundeswehr was formed in December, 7 months after the Warsaw Pact. So, who was reacting to who? Now, moving on.
A side note I just want to bring attention to, we generally tend to think of the Eastern nations as the Red Bloc, the Communist Bloc, the Soviet Bloc, and thereby just stating that they were effectively ruled by the Soviets and their leaders were all just puppets. You can say that if you want, but you can also make a similar case for West Germany, France, Italy, and Greece being American puppets. France was basically completely indebted to America thanks to the Marshall Plan. It wasn't just aid, it basically allowed the US to have a free market in advertising throughout the entirety of Western Europe.
A claim that Russian bots simply love to push on. I myself am Canadian, and all our allies are just merely pawns of the US. This argument is also easily debunked, as other Western nations have been disagreeing with the US on a lot of topics for decades. Whenever the Eastern Bloc did this, the USSR simply used brute force to turn it around, just like in East Germany, Hungary, Poland, and Czechoslovakia. When did the US invade its allies whenever they disagreed or put up walls to stop its defectors? Oh, that's right, it never did. But now let's reach his proposition that we've touched on earlier.
The other nagging question, of course, everybody wonders about is, what of the wall? Now, the usual narrative, as we all know, goes, East Germany crappy, people know like Ostland, everybody jump into West-Berlin. Well, the brain drain, as I mentioned before, was definitely a part of it, but again, the way this is being told is pretty crap in and of itself, so it's quite sobering then to read the East's perspective on it. Firstly, this is not how a nation naturally has its capital. Nobody would find it particularly fair if America's capital was located in Mexico, and the capital then was also shared with the Mexican state. That's just not how you do it. So having a capital city split in two within the opposing country is not good for the weaker side, period. This can be seen if you look at how the West changed their currency in 1948, which disrupted the flow of things by having two currency areas literally side by side, intermingling with one another. West Berlin was also being militarily dominated and even had access to nuclear arsenals and nuclear training programs. It had been made very aware at the time that the NATO-supported FRG had the intent of eventually annexing the DDR. Now, the Aussies had sent numerous instructions of diplomacy, please stop this weapons program, for the previous 3 years, all of which were denied, and it was a call for sorting out the very unorthodox structure between the new nation's geography, rather than stoke the flames of tension by creating more and more atomic bombs.
Now he's saying this really slowly, so I have to start with my first objection. West Berlin was not the capital of West Germany. Bonn was the capital of West Germany. This basically shows that your video is wonky and you don't know what you're talking about. But let's see your sorry-ass argument as to why the Berlin Wall was there.
Additionally, we can also talk about the espionage that was being done by the West. Over 90 espionage organizations have been set up within the city, as well as radio broadcast and sabotaging networks designed to fragment the nation up a considerable amount. There were reported bomb threats by Western agents on DDR infrastructure, as well as numerous killings of border guards. I think it's clear from what we've seen here that there was a lot more context surrounding the situation than simply the standard West good, Ost schlecht narrative behind the wall that had just as much to do with war, espionage, and sabotage as it did to do with brain drain. I think given the circumstances we understand why it is that the latter occurred.
Oh, for God's sake. This was the Cold War. There was espionage on both sides. The Cold War is literally defined as a time of espionage, and I really didn't expect you to comment on the lovely attacks by East Germans, such as the murder of Major Arthur D. Nicholson, which should have been an act of war in 1985. He talks as if the Berlin Wall was made to keep Westerners out. If you actually look at the wall, you can see for yourself that most border posts and spotlights and the barbed wire were pointed at the east side of Berlin. During the Cold War, about 3.5 million East Germans defected to the West, and that was before 1961 alone. In contrast to that, only 11 West Germans defected to the East throughout the Cold War. It's quite obvious that his arguments are getting worse. But we're not done.
Side note, the USSR actually spent more of its product on R&D than actually many other Western nations did, but it had to use the majority of this on supporting its growing arms race. So when people like History Hub like to make a little slander by saying, oh, the USSR didn't care about its citizens, it just liked to spend money on war and rockets and all that, that's because it had to, not because it wanted to. So, yeah. Anyway.
Oh yeah, the big glorification of Russia. This guy would be a good bot in Putin's arms. Film theory can explain this topic, for me.
Historic example, try the Soviet Union, where during the Cold War, the country sold off some of its huge natural gas reserve. But did they use the profits to help their people out? Not exactly. It was more like this. The Soviet people were like, oh, wise government, we need potatoes and also pants. And we're also Italian for some reason. The Soviet leaders were like, no, we're going to use this money for weapons research. We're pretty sure you actually want nuclear warheads. Soviet people respond with no, thank you very much, but we actually just really need the pants. It's like minus 40 degrees here in Siberia. No, trust us, you're going to love these atomic bombs. They're very warm. I have no clue how many...
So then he goes on some more ranting as to how people love the Soviet system, which he takes completely out of context. But then he says this.
But there was, however, one silver lining of sorts in Germany. After the fall, many Aussies looking for employment left towards the Rhineland and brought with them the teachings and experiences they'd gained under the DDR, which enabled Westies a more expansive view on the rights of workers, i.e., you are allowed good childcare, and you should demand it. The downside, however, is that because of the diaspora and the economic despair East Germany was left in, the space has been filled in recent times by right-wing groups, including neo-Nazis.
Oh, here we go again. The sole Soviet communism to save the day, which he gets wrong too. Now, I have said this in a video previously. I don't support communism, but I do believe in socialized services, and I can tell you that they did not come from communism. Canada, for example, got socialized services such as universal healthcare or paid education from politician Tommy Douglas, who had nothing to do with the Soviet Union. Europe and Japan got its socialized services from the Marshall Plan because aspects such as universal healthcare or paid maternity or workers' rights were all originally from Franklin D. Roosevelt's dream.
In our day, certain economic truths have become accepted as self-evident. A second Bill of Rights, under which a new basis of security and prosperity can be established for all, regardless of station or race or creed. Among these are the right to a useful and remunerative job, the right to earn enough to provide adequate food and clothing and recreation, the right of every farmer to raise and sell his products at a return which will give him and his family a decent living, the right of every businessman, large and small, to trade in an atmosphere of freedom, freedom from unfair competition and domination by monopolies at home or abroad, the right of every family to a decent home, the right to adequate medical care and the opportunity to achieve and enjoy good health, the right to adequate protection from the economic fears of old age, sickness, accident, and unemployment, the right to a good education. All of these rights spell security. And after this war is won, we must be prepared to move forward in the implementation of these rights to new goals of human happiness and well-being. For unless there is security here at home, there cannot be lasting peace in the world.
However, he died before World War II could end, and he couldn't implement them in the US, but he did place it in the Marshall Plan. But let's go to the parts about life in communism being very good.
In East Germany, plenty of low-level working people were allowed to go on cheap, relatively modest holidays with their families, only inside red countries and mostly within the GDR. Today, former Aussies have virtually no travel restrictions and can technically go and live anywhere they want in the world. However, for the majority of poorer people today, that simply isn't an option. The market actually prevents them from enjoying a level of satisfaction that they got in the old days.
Yeah, and that was it. Of course, people who travel close by had it cheaply. Westerners could also travel cheaply in other Western countries. Not only that, they could also travel throughout the world. And on top of that, they could travel a lot more. Why? Because they had more money than the East.
A salient example of the perils of this economistic mindset is a study that was done in 2006. Many Aussie men have since declared that their relationships and dating life have improved under capitalism. And immediately we'd argue, yeah, that's a plus for capitalism. In your face, commies. But if you find out their reasoning for this, it's not so glamorous. The most common reason they stated was because it gave men a stronger role in economic life. And he who controls the money controls the household. These men list the reasoning that under capitalism they have more economic dominance. And so therefore, women are easier. Something deep inside tells me that that's not a particularly good reason to prefer your relation.
This is the most retarded argument he makes in the whole video, as if women were treated equally in the Eastern Bloc, when in reality they were also placed in a more submissive role. Abortion was illegal, feminism was suppressed, it was near impossible to get a divorce, they only held a small role in politics, women's organizations were restricted, and I don't even want to talk about women being sent to gulags. I honestly don't know where he is aiming at here.
A common opinion that you'll always hear from people of former red states is that they never felt more relaxed than they were in the old days. The removal of existential threats and the knowledge that you were being looked after, to whatever extent they could manage, is definitely something that an enormous amount of us today would desire and benefit from hugely.
We're back on this topic. Time to take things out of context yet again. If you look at opinion polls of Russian favorability in Eastern Europe, you'll notice that they're mostly negative. Why? Because of the Soviet Union and its policies. Virtually no one liked it. No one likes the idea of suppressed speech or a secretive police or lack of economic rights or lack of freedom of assembly or lack of freedom of religion or no freedom of movement, and no one most certainly likes suffering the humiliation of driving a Yugo. None of these rights became guaranteed until Glasnost and Perestroika were implemented by Gorbachev. Even today, Russian leaders don't want to return to Soviet policies. They merely want influence over old Soviet states. I think it's safe to say that the Iron Curtain was crap. Now, in conclusion, I want to answer this commie's question as to why East Germany and the other Soviet republics were poor. They were poor because collectivized agriculture stymied production and often led to famine. Corruption was rife because the government had direct control over all resources and companies, which left very little for the people. Collectivized production also left little resources for innovation. And tied to that, you cannot pay completely different trades the same amount of a salary. You just cannot. That is why communism has collapsed all over the world, and only a few nations still have its policies. It is a dead ideology, and it's time to leave it there.